Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, a conversation that centers on democracy and the next generation of Americans, our children. Tonight's discussion lifts up these future voters and citizens and focuses on the essential connection between the civics and history taught in their classrooms and our ability to put this democracy on a healthy track. I'm Marcia Eli from the Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History and the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. This weekend began early voting in New York City. When you think of libraries, you may not instantly think of voter education. BPL, we are on the ground in Brooklyn's neighborhoods, conducting exactly that kind of engagement through the library's 61 branches. We organize civic-focused story times and youth engagements, and we share valuable resources about voting and elections on our website. We'll be putting a link to the BPL Civic Engagement page in the chat so you can see what I'm talking about. BPL also, I want to mention, masterminded an initiative titled the 28th Amendment Project. For that, the folks at BPL Presents listened to Brooklynites in 32 town hall meetings and distilled what they said into a proposed amendment to the Constitution. And you can explore it again through the link that will go in the chat. And I think it's up on the screen as well. I'm very, very proud to be partnering on this program with my colleagues in civic engagement. And I'm also honored to be joining hands with our sister library systems, New York Public Library and Queens Public Library. On behalf of all of the collaborators, thank you to the Go Vote New York City Fund in the New York Community Trust for making tonight possible. Finally, a personal thank you to the folks at Educating for American Democracy. Thank you for your help and support as we crafted tonight's conversation. And I know all of you will learn a lot more about their work in the next hour. So there is an extraordinary panel here tonight, and I'm very eager to hear what they have to say. I invite all of you to share your questions for them by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you would like to enable closed captioning, that function in a minute will be enabled too at the bottom of your screen. There it is. So you just click that icon where it says live transcript for closed captioning. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Caleb Gayle. Caleb is CEO of the National Conference of Citizenship. His writing has been published in The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, The Guardian, and many other places. Caleb, thank you so much for leading this conversation, and I turn it all over to you.
Marcia, thank you as always. It's always such a pleasure to be in conversation with not just the BPL, the people that they invite, but also all of you who are listening in, watching from your homes and from wherever else you might be, to have a conversation about why exactly democracy is just simply not a drill. Breaking the glass, right? Quite a break glass in case of emergency, right? The vividness of that image should present to us just how critical this conversation and the conversations you all are having continuously beyond this conversation actually might be. So let me, without further ado, kind of introduce who we have on our panel this evening. First, we have Dr. Paul Carrese. He's the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. His expertise in grand strategy, constitutionalism, and the roots of our civic engagement landscape can be found in his book, Cloaking of Power, and of course also in his 3 co-edited books, as well as his prolific writing throughout a variety of different publications. Also, we have Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries, Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University. He focuses on and teaches about civil rights and the Black Power movement. Many of you are likely familiar with Dr. Jeffries from his podcast, Learning for Justice, a production of the Teaching Tolerance Division of the Southern Poverty Law Center. We also have relatively my neighbor, if you will, Dr. Kei Kawashima-Ginsberg, the Newhouse Director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, otherwise known as CIRCLE, at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts. For some context, CIRCLE is an organization that even my organization, the National Conference on Citizenship, knows very well, in part because of the critical data insights on youth, civic, and political learning and engagement that they offer. So it should come at no surprise that Dr. Kawashima-Ginsberg served as the principal investigator for the Educating for Democracy roadmap that many of you are likely familiar with, and is also a member of the Educating for American Democracy's implementation consortium. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jenna Ryall, who's the Director of Civics for All at the New York City Department of Education, where she runs the city's comprehensive K-12 or K through 12 civic education program available to all NYC DOE, all the acronyms under the sun, NYC DOE schools. Among Civic for All's many components are a K through 12 curriculum, a school-based participatory budgeting effort, which is quite novel and interesting. We hope you hear about this evening, as well as a student voter registration drive responsible for registering 50,000 new voters in the last 3 years. So if you're all not exhausted hearing about just how incredibly talented and impressive our panel members are, we can perhaps move directly into our first question. So the first one, and this is for anyone, so it's a free-for-all, really kind of reflects a bit on some bipartisan luck and good fortune that we've been able to have thanks to Congressman Tom Cole from my home state, Oklahoma, and Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who came together to craft a relatively sweeping piece of legislation on civic education called Civics Secures Democracy Act. To the point of legislation, Congresswoman DeLauro called civic education a national security imperative. Can you help our audience, and quite frankly, even me, understand all that's at stake, not just with this bill, right, but with the overall importance for civic education?
I'll jump in, Caleb. Thank you for that kind introduction. The Educating for American Democracy report and the roadmap it produced did make these kinds of arguments that the steady downward spiral of American public discourse toward more violent language and then acts of violence about political issues becoming almost normal in the past decade, but declining trust in American institutions all suggests that a national consensus effort was needed to try to pull together educators and thinkers and other stakeholders, left, right, and center, to think about renewed attention to, renewed priority for, support for K-12 educators, especially those in social studies, history, civics education, to have some support for the idea that citizens don't just happen. Self-governing, informed, engaged citizens, it doesn't happen automatically. It requires extensive educational investment and effort in schools, beyond schools, and these bad public effects, you could say. And I'll just say one more about that. We had a retired 3-star general, H.R. McMaster, not the Hoover institution, speak at our department, our school at Arizona State University just a couple of weeks ago on this theme, that if there isn't a healthy civic public discourse, that moves up into, that sort of dysfunction moves up into elected officials, appointed officials, and you can't make and then sustain national security policies over a long period of time, which is exactly what you need in a very complicated and dangerous world. So we're paying the price for these educational deficits that have built up over several decades.
That's incredibly helpful, right? The the question really at stake is almost the sustainability of an inherently more fragile system, right? System of democracy, right? And so if not a more robust and embedded kind of framework for educating people on matters of civics and civic education and history, for that matter, we might be endangering the sustainability of our very fragile, right, democratic system. I don't want to jump in and answer any questions for you all. So if anyone else, again, this is a free for all.
If I could weigh in on that question, Caleb, you know, certainly we can see the lack of sort of really a good grasp of civics can lead to the kind of vitriol we see in the public discourse now. But the absence of a good civic public understanding can lead to corrosion, not just of the discourse, public discourse, but corrosion of the institutions that we depend upon for the smooth functioning of democracy itself. If people don't, it comes down to this: if people don't understand the way government actually works, then anyone can pitch a particular lie that they will believe, that then leads them to question the very credibility of these democratic institutions. And so part of what we're also seeing is people just simply not understanding the way government actually works and functions, the way the electoral process works and functions, the checks and balances, the way they work and function. And if you don't have a good understanding, a good public grasp of that, then while you can claim anything, you can question anything. And then I think that is not just a slippery road, a slippery slope, but that is a deep pit, a quick descent into chaos, and a quick unraveling of what we have seen, certainly since the beginning of this republic, but has become evidently clear over the last 4 or 5 years, the fragility of this democracy. We are dependent upon institutions, and the guardrails are not that high. And so unless people understand what they are, then we can easily jump over them.
Yeah, it almost seems as if what you're saying, even more than that, is perhaps it's not limited to perhaps what's happening in the classroom, right? It extends so much farther beyond that, right? How are we constantly reinvigorating our civic health with a greater sense of understanding of how our systems of government work, perhaps even at the most local of levels, right? Not just at the most local of levels, but also through our state, county, and federal governments, right? So if we don't actually have the sort of, it kind of goes to Dr. Carrese's point that we're further injuring the sustainability, right, and dynamism of our democratic system if we don't functionally understand how it all works to some extent.
Caleb, if I could
Please.
add on what Dr. Carrese, I jotted down, as he said, citizens don't just happen. And I think when we think about that entry point, as the person who's working at the Department of Education, right, and starting with kindergarten, I'm always thinking about that starting point. And an organization that we work with a lot here, MICVA Challenge, says that young people aren't apathetic, they're uninvited. And that invitation into civic life comes in the form of civic education, right? So how many things as adults are we willing to dive into without any sense of what we're doing or how we're doing it? And so I don't think when you consider that it's much of a surprise that young people who receive quality civics education are more likely to vote. They're more likely to volunteer in their community. They're more likely to work within their community because they've received the preparation for that. And so what's so important about civic education is that it's not solely the understanding the foundations of our nation and our government, but how we think about and form our own roles as individuals in society. On a macro level, our democracy is dependent on our society having that understanding. But on a micro level, the success of our young people individually is dependent on that understanding as well.
Without a doubt, to some extent, it almost kind of leads to this question where, it seems as if, yes, right, bipartisan luck and stroke of good fortune, that this current bill has kind of begs the question, right? What's what's either missing either in this bill or in a general discourse about civic education, right? And this is, again, a question for all of you. If you feel so moved, it almost seems as if, Jenna, you were kind of leading to some of that, right? There's this question of how we couch the invitation to become citizens, right? Or to fully step into a more fulsome understanding of our civic responsibilities and duties. But to some extent, either in this particular piece of legislation or just generally when it comes to our discourse about civic education, where are we missing? Where are we missing the boat, or perhaps where do the greatest opportunities actually lie, right? Beyond either this legislation or our general discourse about civic education.
Maybe I can pick up where Jenna sort of started to say something about starting point. So in civics, we've typically focused on the content of civics fact and not so much about kind of how we build whole human being who are respected, who are validated, who are invited to civic life from the first day of kindergarten. So we tended as a community to sort of start civic education in middle school and really do it all, in high school in some cases by state legislation. I think we are starting to move in the direction of thinking of students as a holistic human being who need to live out in the constitutional democracy from day one and not just learn about it. And it's especially important when we think about how diverse our students have become. Not everybody has had kind of multiple generation of American life. Sometimes they're coming to the United States for the first time, or they are really never been invited because they're coming from, communities of color or other marginalized and oppressed groups. So school is an opportunity where everyone can come together and learn together, and sometimes unlearn some of the mistakes we've made as democracy to live better democracy, right? So I think sometimes we forget that it's not just content and facts that we're trying to get to students, and that alone's never enough. So we are starting to move in that direction, but I think we have so many more conversations we need to have around that.
Yeah, it sounds like Dr. Carrese, you wanted to kind of get in there as well.
Sure, I'll jump in just to say Kei and I are two of the 7 co-authors of this Educating for American Democracy study and then a roadmap. To pick up on a couple of other comments already made, that the roadmap is not a full curriculum. So what the New York City Public Schools have decided to do is take up this framework. And in our American constitutional principle of federalism, it's at the state and local level that educators, communities, various stakeholders need to come together to say this is a priority, more of a priority than it's been. And here is our process of determining what a revised, improved curriculum K through 12 will be. But our contribution, as Kei mentioned, was to suggest that in a very polarized time, we should emphasize the civic virtues as well as the civic knowledge needed for a high school graduate, let's say, to be an informed, engaged citizen. So the civic virtues speak to the idea of the fact that Americans have always disagreed about just about everything from our political founding, the 1770s onward. We agree about some things, liberty, equality, rights, the rule of law, et cetera, our complex constitutional order, but exactly what these mean, what are the failings in living up to them, what are the priorities and how you fit them together, that requires civic virtues. We're committed to each other. We're civic friends. We're citizens and members of a community together, but we will disagree, and so we have to have a principle of civil disagreement. Another phrase that we use is reflective patriotism, that Americans, we think, or at least students, ought to have teachers put in front of them the idea that you should be grateful to be American, and yet there's not a claim the place is perfect, always has been perfect, is perfect now. So we are reflective patriots who want to argue about America even while we're grateful for being American. So that complex package of educational challenges is what states and localities need to tackle. But again, if we don't tackle it, it's not as if the constitutional democratic order is just automatically perpetuated. If you don't pay attention to this, you have big problems.
It almost seems that kind of cues up a really important kind of moment to both be present in the moment of a lot of interesting political conversation and social kind of dialogue, right? So to some extent, Dr. Jeffries, it almost seems as if, both in the question of kind of the overall civic health and the development of civic knowledge, as well as the hope for more civil discourse within an incredibly polarized time, it seems like we're kind of seeing the collision of all of those sorts of desires and wants with the question of the teaching of a fulsome picture of history, right? I would have gandered to guess that quite a bit of some of the content that you cover in a lot of your academic scholarship, as well as what you might even talk about on your podcast, might be for some, fodder for trying to attach or align that with a much more bastardized version of critical race theory, right? And we've always, as Dr. Carrese said, have had disagreements about just about everything. And educating our kids as to what happened historically is just probably our most recent vitriolic dust up, right? So to some extent, I kind of want to spend just a little bit of time reflecting on kind of what is the potency, what's left on the table, perhaps, right? If we also leave on the table a more rich and fulsome understanding of history within the classroom, especially given kind of this very interesting moment that we're in which we have attached, to some extent, the potency of history with a really bastardized and mangled version of an understanding of critical race theory, which really wouldn't necessarily apply to what would be happening in an invitation, right, for kindergartners to learn about what it means to be an American.
It's one of the reasons why the moment in which we live is why it's so vitally important that when talking about sort of civic and civic virtue, that we ground it in an honest telling of the past, is because if we don't talk honestly about the past, especially those aspects of the past that make us uncomfortable, those aspects of sort of the American past, particularly as it revolves around politics, that were grounded in the exploitation of people of color, then we cannot make sense of the legacy of that, which still impacts and influences us today. I mean, we can draw a straight line. A lot of people were shocked and include me in that group with what happened on January 6th of this year in the storming of the Capitol. But none of us should have been surprised because there is a long history of political violence in the United States, rooted in the belief that Black participation in the political process automatically, inherently undermines the credibility and validity of whatever that electoral outcome is. You can draw a straight line from the efforts to overturn Reconstruction through the period of disenfranchisement and constitutional disenfranchisement at the turn of the century to the pushback against the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s to the present. And so that it is an uncomfortable history. People died, right? I mean, John Lewis, we honor John Lewis today, not because he was just singing songs, but because he was risking his life and others died along with him. And if we don't understand that, our government, this democracy has been fought for, and the sacrifices that it has required of people in order to sustain it, even in its imperfect way, then what we teach our students today is a fiction. And that's the one thing we can't do. We can't teach them a fiction because that is not the way to sustain a truly multiracial, truly inclusive democratic, to maintain an inclusive multiracial democracy. We're setting ourselves up for disaster if we don't lean into, now more so than ever, an honest version of the past, even as difficult and as troubling as it is.
Mm. Yeah, it seems as if perhaps, right, like it's the discomfort that kind of provokes a certain level of fear, which then leads to a certain level of pushback on the idea of diving into that history, without realizing that history is perhaps the very like foreground that we need in order to have a rich conversation about how to be inclusive going forward. But I think even more so, Dr. Kawashima-Ginsberg, it seems to me that there's always this persistent issue within this kind of civic education and civic health and civic engagement space broadly defined. There's this difficulty that persists with the struggle to sometimes measure impact, right? And I know that your team at CIRCLE has in part made it their business to do some of that, right? Your team maintains perhaps some of the largest data sets on civic life among young people, right? And this bill and many other efforts could in some form or fashion have a significant impact, but immediately, even as someone who runs a nonprofit, I immediately think to myself, what's the size of that potential impact? What is the nature of that potential impact? What tools could we deploy to better assess the impact of our work? So, I mean, if you could help me, right? Selfishly, this whole panel is actually just about me, but no, truly to help all of us listening. How can we do that better, and how are your teammates and your colleagues really thinking carefully about that?
Thank you. And it's a really great and complex question because, as somebody that runs a civic health organizations, there's so many facets to that, right? Both in terms of how young people engage with politics, which may be through movements, which might be through registering other people even before they're eligible to vote, to, saying something on social media about what they believe in political issues. So there's lots of ways in which young people engage, and then lots of ways that young people grow up to become leaders and community members as adults and build our civic health. So I'm going to try to simplify and talk about maybe 3 different buckets that we can at least start to think about measuring. One is, of course, investment in civic education itself. So I think at EAD, we say that there's about 5 cents per student invested into civics per year, which is far, far, far less than other subjects. And of course, every subject should deserve much more than 5 cents a year. We're not saying we should take away money from other subjects, but we should really be investing in it. Now, with that meager of a support from the federal government going to be in nationwide kind of students, millions of them, the problem is that then it's going to depend on the state and the community and their political will and their wealth to be able to get the civic education students actually deserve. So currently there's already great inequality from community to community and state to state in terms of how much investment has been made, both in terms of supporting educators, but also to provide curriculum that's updated, the textbooks that really include these multiple perspectives like Paul was saying. So that itself would be an outcome to really think about in what ways are we improving the equity and the size of investment in civic education across states and across different groups of students. There are many groups of students who've been neglected. For example, students with disability, where they may not be getting the kind of civic education that's personalized and suited for their needs. The second kind of measurements we can start to get are things like students' excellence in civic achievement. So by that, I mean things like civic knowledge, disposition, or virtues, and skills to effectively participate in civic life. There is one big national measure called National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, which has been done in civics and history. And history, for example, has had quite a decline in the recent years. Civics has been really stagnant and low in terms of achievement. That assessment itself actually isn't happening often enough or in enough grades to allow us to really understand what should 4th graders know, what should 8th graders be able to think about, and what can 12th graders do. Right now, it's only happening in 8th grade, and it can really help us understand how we're doing state by state. So when the measurement's too, broad-based and can only give us like 1 score per assessment, it doesn't really help state agencies and local agencies solve that challenge. So at minimum, we need more that kind of thorough assessment of civic cognition and civic knowledge. even more though are things that students and young people are producing and doing, right? So there's one way to kind of test knowledge. It's another to be able to kind of look at nationwide group of young people to say exactly about how many of the young people say they've really done something meaningful in civic life, whether it's, walking on the protest and marches or registering others. There's so many ways to measure that. But we do gather that information through a census, for example, and we need to see that more and more. And maybe we need to be renovating again about what we're measuring, given a framework like this one. The third is barometers of civic health. And those are things like how many people are participating in community meetings, city council meetings, who's running for office, how representative are our elected officials at the state and local level and Congress. So those are societal measures that I have a hope of seeing change in with something like Civic Secure Democracy Act, because that's a game-changing kind of investment that we've never seen. We should be able to produce lots of outcomes and test how we can do better over and over. And that we have a hope for having a whole generation of young people who would come up and become adults and even young people to lead our community and improve our civic health.
That's incredibly helpful, right? It almost provides a bit of a framework for all of us to kind of adopt in our minds, right? That provides also a little bit of flexibility. To some extent, you were kind of, pushing us to think also that given the significant range from city to city or school district to school district for that matter, even within cities, right, there might be a significant divergence in the amount of time and resources dedicated specifically for the development of civic knowledge. And to some extent, Jenna, your city is kind of the shining city on a hill, right? To some extent, right? New York City's DOE has really actually tested out, right, whether there's a curricular approach that could lead to a more fulsome civic education, a greater focus on our civic health. And so, given that we hope that this conversation, whether for those who are listening right now and listening across the country after this call in recorded fashion, in asynchronous fashion, we hope this is helpful to actual educators and education leaders and parents who hope to see that their kids are, as he mentioned, invited, right, to the experience of becoming more civically engaged and educated. What were the challenges, right, to bringing this curricular approach to scale, right? And where are the kind of the greatest opportunities for improvement, and not just improvement within DOE, but sort of what are the discernible and generalizable lessons that we could perhaps take to other cities and other school districts around the country? Would be really helpful, I think, to our audience to kind of glean from your experience and this expertise, the burgeoning expertise that New York City's DOE has developed.
Yeah, thank you. I think to start out, I have to say we started our initiative in the spring of 2018, and how I wish EAD had predated that as opposed to the other way around, because now we're seeing it reflected in the roadmap and in the themes, a lot of the things that we learned the hard way, right? And so a little bit of background: in the spring of 2018, Civics for All was part of Mayor de Blasio's 10-point Democracy NYC plan. And the original language was, we will begin teaching civics in New York City public schools. And I was on the social studies team here centrally at the time. And I'll be honest, I read that and was like, begin? What? Like, we are teaching civics in New York City's public schools. And that required us to take a hard look at what we were really doing. Like, what's happening in schools that's the language. And we had an existing social studies curriculum. We have an existing social studies curriculum, the Passport to Social Studies. And in reflecting on that, realized that we were doing, if we do say so ourselves, a great job of teaching the foundations of American government, getting students to understand those principles of democracy. What we were not doing at all in that curriculum, and I would, I don't want to speak for everyone, I know it was happening in some schools, but as a system, was teaching students or allowing students the space to think about how the systems they were learning about impact them and how they can impact those systems. And so from there, Civics for All was born. And so Civics for All is a comprehensive K-12 initiative that includes a curriculum, but it also includes a lot of opportunities to center student voice. And at the heart of it is, in creating that curriculum, it needed to be flexible enough to be implemented in teachers' classrooms throughout the system without necessarily giving them more time in their day. And so by being really mindful of where these civics principles align to what we were already teaching in social studies, and then beyond that, what we were teaching in literacy and science and math, and how civics could become the water that our students were swimming in, as opposed to just the one thing they were doing at one point in their day. And so that's just, a little bit of background. Our resources are available to all 1,800 schools in our system. And so what we're in the process of doing this year is taking those existing resources and what exists in our initiative and aligning it to the existing language in the roadmap. So we found early on that what we were doing was aligning really well. And so we're in the unique position of having rolled out this approach. Realistically, and I don't imagine this is a surprise, but the biggest challenge is exactly what the bill and EAD are trying to address is, continues to be getting those who make the decisions about what gets priority in the classroom to see civics as essential. So we are very fortunate as a system that we've had multiple chancellors and a mayor who have agreed that civics education is an essential part of a student's core academic program. But a huge part of getting superintendents and school leaders and teachers to embrace, we call our program Civics for All, but embrace civics education and bring it to their students has been making it clear that civics is incredibly relevant to our students' lives and that it is essential for their success, not just within the classroom and within the school, but outside of the school walls. And so that knowledge is also our greatest opportunity for scaling this approach. We have schools talking a lot about social emotional learning right now. They're bringing students back into the classroom. They're incorporating SEL. Civics is grounded in the same principles as social emotional learning. Civic engagement is a way to incorporate those principles in the academic setting. Teachers are focused on ensuring that they have culturally responsive practices. They've built culturally responsive classroom environments. Civics education puts your students at the center. If you are doing civics education right, your lesson can't move forward if your students aren't bringing their lived experiences into the lesson, and that is as responsive as you can get. And so when we help adults to see all of the places where civics is necessary for their own success as adults, and where it's necessary to build the knowledge, the skills, the dispositions that they want their students to embody, their children to embody, then we start to see an embracing of bringing civics into the classroom and a prioritizing of civics. And like I said, I use that phrase of the water we swim in all the time because it doesn't need to be and it shouldn't be this extra thing we're doing because it should be touching everything our students.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're trying to make the opportunities to engage ubiquitous, right, to the student experience, right, where they're touching it not just in a particular history class as Kei was mentioning earlier, right? But in fact, they're seeing it in a variety of different places. The invitation is continuously available to them. And it almost begs the question, as we draw to a close and open up the conversation to our audience for questions, kind of, no, I'm not going to ask the Pollyannish question of like, is there hope, right? We know there's hope, but like, where exactly do we locate it, right? And then not just where do we locate it, but then how do we, activate or convert that hope into kind of meaningful actions that people can be doing on a more continuous basis? Where do we see that hope and how do we turn that hope into reasonable and meaningful actions? And that question can go to anyone.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say
ready.
that one emphasis we tried to make in the Educating for American Democracy report and roadmap is that we were deliberately designed as a national consensus effort. I'm a constitutional conservative. We had a range of viewpoints and sector experiences in the 7-member team, but then we had hundreds of people across 2 years. And in a way, the implementation project is still going on. So this is a trick that Jenna and her teachers might use in the classroom. We have Latin on the dollar bill. The Latin root for citizen is the same root for the word civilization. So this is her swimming in the water. If we've had 40 or 50 years in public schools of emphasizing science, technology, math, because those seem less controversial and more useful. And emphasizing preparing for a competitive global economy. There's only so far that emphasis can go before the foundations break down. You're not going to perform well in a competitive, globalized world, and you won't be having success with graduation rates and support for public schools and all of these questions unless there's a healthy civic culture that's at the core of public schools and private schools as well. So this has to be a commitment of civic and political communities and school districts and states. It's got to come from the bottom up. I guess Kei and I would think that the Federal Department of Education and the Federal National Endowment for Humanities did their part by calling for a national study. They picked an excellent team of the 7 of us, absolutely outstanding team. We've offered our roadmap and our report, but now local people, state by state, locality by locality, have got to take up this challenge and see that the stakes are very real. If there can't be more light and a little less heat around this set of questions, there's not a promising future that we're offering to young people about our whole civic constitutional order, but also, again, about their employment prospects, their life prospects, our very technological, complicated world. We're not setting them up for success.
That's so helpful. It seems like, Kei, you wanted to jump in there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Caleb. I shared similar view too, but I also, as somebody that studies young people, I have to say I have a lot of hope in young people with education like this that really takes them seriously, their capacity to ask questions about our democracy and constitution and engage in democratic life in really serious and rigorous way, right? I think it also leads to students really feeling like they can be responsible, they can own their own education. And my hope is that civic education isn't just content and social studies, but it's a lifestyle, like Jenna's saying. And so it becomes a lifestyle for students to engage with vigor with what's going on in their community, starting with their own school. And I think it has a lot of potential about how students become a member of a community as a school and as a city and town. And that can really change how we look at education and how we look at our towns and communities. So I have some hope. Young people are really excited today. They can do a lot.
I share that hope. And I don't think, and I think that hope is also has historical expression. When we look back to the 1960s, for example, through the 70s, whether it's students organizing against the war or civil rights demonstrations, or even more recently, March for Our Lives, students organizing against gun violence, Black Lives Matter. But I think we also have to state what we haven't stated, that is also quite obvious, and it's an obstacle, that not everybody is on board with this. Not everybody is on board with what we're talking about. Literally, you have legislation here in Ohio, and many of the sort of state legislative, sort of controversial topics legislation includes language that says we do not want our schools essentially giving credit for students engaging and participating in these aspects of civic life. And so it's not just a matter of saying, hey, here's a framework, look what we've done, we all agree, let's participate. You have people who are actively working against this, who say social emotional learning is Marxist in some way, shape, or form. And so what do we do with that? If we have a group of people who are saying, wait a minute, educating people, educating students, right? And not manipulating them, but saying, this is the way government works. This is the way we should participate. Fair exchange of ideas is now being confronted with a very vocal group of folk who are with political power, who are saying, no, you either have this sort of uncritical view of the past and the present, or we don't play at all, or we don't talk about this at all. I'm not sure what we do with that, but that is the environment that we find ourselves in right now.
That's a useful reminder, Dr. Jeffries. So, and it seems like Dr. Carrese was trying to get in there as well. So I almost want to throw this question to the group, but also to, invite Dr. Carrese to chime in there, which is, to some extent, right, the obstacles are becoming clearer, right, than possibly they have been before. So exactly, how do we, in the interest of ensuring that students do have a fulsome understanding of who they are as an American and what that means and what that has always meant, right, and how it's changed over time, kind of what then, right? Like it immediately asks the questions, it begs the question, what then do we do, given how significant and perhaps how loud that oppositional voice is on matters of a fulsome understanding of who we can be and who we have been?
You just wanted to follow up on Professor Jeffries' point that the response from educators, parents, community, stakeholders, school leaders, others can be to emphasize the positive, to emphasize light, to meet heat with light, and to meet kind of negativity with the positive objective, to prepare young people to learn how to be free and equal, which means disagreeing with each other. Again, certain principles in common, but learning how to talk through important contentious issues, both historical and current. So I think Kei mentioned quite a while ago, one of the approaches we took in the EAD report and the roadmap was to frame questions. Now, most of these are not the students who are going to be reading this report in the roadmap, but the teachers, the educators, the curriculum designers. But at the age appropriate, grade level appropriate way, you can just pass along the students to the students these questions, right? And then you can think of all kinds of ways to have, debates or projects or ways to work from civic knowledge to civic virtues. As a positive way, rather than, I'm worried, I agree with Dr. Jeffries that the response of some people to just say, these are so contentious, these issues about American history and American civics and how you teach it, that's just going to lead us down the path we've been on, whereby the funding and the priority and the attention goes to science, technology, math, and to reading and language arts, because those are less controversial and those are more useful. And then, we are headed in not a good direction. So I think educators have to come together and find some consensus points, but teaching about questions and disagreements is one way to try to get to those consensus points.
Without a doubt, and it seems as if even in this most recent or current Virginia gubernatorial campaign, right, it seems as if education and how we educate and who is involved in the decision-making around what is taught has become a bit of a political volleyball. And to some extent, right, it's these conversations that root, right, the hope and the need for much more robust and fulsome understanding of our American kind of collective American identity and history, right, are the ways in which we can kind of hopefully cut through the noise with a signal that's meaningful to some of those educators, some of those parents, some of those education leaders somewhere. So before we kind of conclude and I pass it back to Marcia to hand off, any other kind of comments on this very topic? Actually, we have another question actually in the Q&A. So let me cut myself off and ask the question, what is the role of parents, right, in this work, right? And I think this question could go to anyone, but where do parents figure into a lot of this?
I'd maybe chime in first, just because I led the work of pedagogy companion development, which really had to do with bridging kind of academy and the theoretical and philosophical content expertise with the everyday practice. And what we did was to bring the first edition of the roadmap, which is on like edition 9 or 8 or whatever we are now. We iterate a lot. That's part of that. But what we did was bring this roadmap version 1 to educators and then ask them, what would it take you to be able to use some of these questions in your classroom? And one of the first thing we heard was, what do we tell parents? I know they want to know what we do in school, and that's part reflection of our politically polarized communities, but they also see, especially kind of younger grades teachers, see parents as partners. They want the repeated conversations about our community, our identities, and our history at home and at school, so that students are really kind of feeling that and swimming in that water. I love that expression. So that was really one of the things I heard and try to reflect in this pedagogy guide, which is that the parents are stakeholders and they're partners and they can be allies, but we have to proactively communicate with them what we mean to do and why we're doing it this way. So I think it's a really important stakeholder.
Definitely, and to that question, right? One of our participants from Colorado, right, is kind of reflecting on this very question, right? Because parents, again, were a feature, or rather, what parents get to and don't get to say in terms of the educational experience of children has been kind of the main political volleyball between Glenn Youngkin and Terry McAuliffe running for governor of Virginia, and that's what our participant from Colorado is asking about, right? In particular, how can we structure participation in civic life so it is as convenient for as many people as possible, right? Like, how do we introduce that convenience to the process and experience of being civically engaged? So and again, like, to anyone, how can we help this person from Colorado kind of understand or structure that sort of participation in a way that's convenient?
Oh, Paul, go ahead.
Well, just in a general way, to repeat the theme that parents should be stakeholders, but every sector and every viewpoint might want to be reintroduced to this basic constitutional principle. Our separation of powers, our federalism is designed with the idea in a way to force people to argue with each other. You're not going to pass any laws. You're not going to achieve any policies unless people will have the civic virtues of listening and reasoning and arguing. Again, more light than heat. So part of the question from Colorado is, how do you set up voting and participation so you can make sure that the various kinds of sectors and stakeholders, to include parents, have voice? But again, you also want to set it up so that if there is more light than heat, you will get more people who might want to participate. I mean, there's some people now who do not want, and I'll put in the school leaders and others who don't want to touch civics and history because it's so angry and so bitterly divided. So to reinforce these civic virtues of reasonable disagreement will bring more participation and more consensus, I think, and more support. It's a long game, but we don't have many other good alternatives.
And if I could add real quick, Caleb, I think it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge, all of us, not just those on this panel, but us as a nation, that there's a much longer tradition of us as a nation making this participation in this democracy more difficult than easier, right? I mean, that's our tradition. But alongside that is a tradition of people who have been fighting to make participation easier for others, to make it more convenient. It's never been convenient for anybody, but we should be striving towards that, to make it more accessible, to make it more convenient. But it's important that we acknowledge that it has never been for everyone. And so that means that we all have to put in some work in order to do our part. Democracy is not, in addition to being fragile, it is not clean, right? It is messy. It is exactly what we were just saying. And this idea of, we've set this up to be contentious, to not be easy necessarily for one particular group. And I think once we acknowledge that this is actually hard work. Now, you can look at some communities, you can look at Black folk and be like, yeah, Black folk will tell you, yeah, this is hard stuff, right? Be able to get your voice heard, but that's okay. Right? We need to be creating avenues and openings for everyone. And that includes bringing in parents to say, listen, you have to be a part of this conversation, not only with your children, but also with your neighbors. right? To make sure people understand how difficult it has been, and it doesn't have to continue to be that way. Although that doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. It's totally fine to disagree. That's why we have this set up, but we have to be willing to listen to others.
To that very point, and we only have a few minutes left, so this is going to be the last question for now. You know, part of, and Jenna, this question is probably directed to you, even though your name isn't the one listed. I want to make sure and get your voice in here because you've been a teacher, right, in the New York City public school system. So, you know, the question for Robert, who's a teacher from Virginia, really harps on perhaps the most forgotten group, right, when talking about education, which are the actual educators, right? So he's asking, how can public school teachers be protected so they actually teach basic civics and history when the truth itself is under attack? Right? He mentioned that he even has had parents demand that he teach factually inaccurate history. And I'm certain that he is not a complete outlier here. And I'm sure that you've had experiences, even in New York City, where people have had reactions to a more fulsome telling of history that's factual, that perhaps weren't delightful. So to some extent, Jenna, it would be great to provide Robert some guidance or some tactile tips on what to do.
Yeah, I mean, if I had the answer in its entirety, I'd be the hero of every teacher in the country right now. I will, you know, I have to be completely honest when it comes to legislating the teaching of incomplete history. I don't have an answer. I don't know that anyone has an answer for that just yet. So I think the response that I'm going to give is stepping away from that, or an environment where that is taking place. And I'm going to kind of turn it, and I'm sure that administrators listening to this kind of should know that this is what's about to come out of my mouth, but the best protection for the teacher is a well-stated and very clear mission by the school administrator. And so if the school is making it a non-negotiable that, well, I taught in a school where our principal made it a non-negotiable that we do not debate the humanity of our students, which meant that I was teaching at the time that we were, gay marriage was in the news, and some parents didn't appreciate the way that it would come up in the class. And it was, we don't debate humanity here. When trans students were under attack in the school that I was working in, that was again her statement. And so the administration having the back of the public school teacher is the most important protection. What I can say as a strategy that I have used in the classroom, and it's come up a few times, is the asking of the questions, the turning it around so that the students are providing some of the content. It's being very clear with parents at the beginning of the school year that this is how my class is structured. These are the topics we're going to be discussing. We will be examining things from multiple perspectives. We will be looking at X, Y, and Z, and making sure that they're aware. What they do with that information is often going to be the issue of the teacher working alongside the administration. But when we talk about parents as partners, what's important, and parents as stakeholders, whether or not they agree with us, it's important that we don't take them by surprise, right? So if parents are going to be stakeholders and we are going to want to invite them in to a role where it's going to make our job easier, then we also need to remember at all times that we are working with their children. They are the parents, we are not the parents, right? And so being really clear about what you were doing and that your classroom is a place where all of these things will be happening. I regularly would tell people I am educating and not indoctrinating, whether they believed that or not. I think, you know, it sometimes just helped to hear it from me. One thing that I love that we have done in classrooms, and then we did citywide as well, is deploy the students to teach. So create opportunities where your students are teaching those basic civic principles to their parents, or even just basic, I mean, to kind of go back a little bit to the previous question, something about making access to civics convenient. New York City started ranked choice voting last year. And so we taught New York City students what ranked choice voting was. And New York City students created workshops for their parents and for the community so that they could then teach their parents, who were possibly the voters, as opposed to the young people, what ranked choice voting was and how it worked and things like that. So half an answer to that question, half an answer to the last question. Robert, as a teacher myself, that is 100% not the answer you wanted, because I'm sure that when I ask that question, I want an answer that's going to give me something I can go into my classroom and do tomorrow. And I have to be honest with you, this is one of the most difficult things I can imagine facing as a history and civics teacher, is the current environment that we're in. And so while it may not mean much, you have the hardest job in the world right now, but you also have the best job in the world. And so you don't hear it enough. And thank you so much for what you are doing and for being here to ask that question, and for being the person in those students' lives who's thinking, how do I make sure that the children who are in front of me are not being exposed to inaccurate history, and that they are going to have the opportunities to participate in civic life as a knowledgeable adult that maybe they're not around all of the time. And so thank you. Sorry that may not be the answer that solves all of our problems, but I hope it helped a little bit.
It might not be the answer that solves all of our problems, but I always find that ending on the tactile oftentimes provides the pathway for hope, right? Such that we're not landing the folks on this call in some sort of theoretical conversation. All of you, thank you so much for constantly driving at a very practical application or lens to some very weighty and significantly difficult societal issues. So thank you, panelists. And I'm going to break all the rules that my Jamaican parents taught me. I'm going to call you by your first names, Hasan, Paul, Kei, and Jenna. I really appreciate it. I'm going to turn it back over to Marcia to end this conversation, but we thank you so much all for attending, and thank you all panelists for discussing perhaps why democracy is just not a drill.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. Caleb, thank you for this incredible conversation you've led. And I want to thank you all for the work that you're doing. Obviously, this is complicated and there are no easy answers. But what's important is to have that conversations like this one as much as we possibly can. And I'm proud to have hosted this one with all of you. There were lots of nuggets and lots of takeaways. And on that note, I want to share with everybody that the program has been recorded. We're going to put a link in the chat to how you can listen to it tomorrow. And I also want to say that there were many questions about parents and lots of conversations about, homeschool and how there can be support between them and roles. And I know, and we'll share with all of you who are listening, that Educating for American Democracy is close to completing a tool for parents. It's called EAD at Home. And as soon as it is ready, we will be putting a link to that EAD at Home tool for parents in Brooklyn Public Library's civic engagement page. And so you can see in the chat where you can find that. You can see where you can watch this recording tomorrow. And also, I hope that you'll explore some of our other programs that are coming down the pipe. We will have something even this Thursday with Dr. Hall, who wrote the book Wake. It's a fascinating graphic novel, and it's very much about history, and history that's hard to tell because you don't have a record for it. It's about women-led slave revolts. So please join us on Thursday for that. Again, thanks to all of you for your work and for sharing so honestly and helping us struggle with some of these really, really, really tough questions that are absolutely essential for the future of our country. So everyone, have a good night. Good night to all.